Hello and welcome to RachAquarelle and to another holiday art series illustration. This time I will be painting this little illustration featuring a hot cocoa stand and some sledders. The colors I will be using will be primarily Payne's Gray, some sepia, Hansa Yellow, and Purell Red. I don't really think I used this burnt sienna, so I haven't used that very much. Haven't really found too much need for it, I guess. So there are going to be a lot of parts of this illustration that I speed up because I think that all of the techniques that I use for this illustration are quite straightforward. And as usual, whenever I have a drawing for these holiday art series tutorials, I make the template available to you for free as an instant download from my Gumroad page. So there's a link for that in the description of the video. You go to that link, find the template or templates that you want, and then in order to get them, you just put a 0 when it asks you to name a fair price because these are available to you for free. Then you can download the file. You may have to adjust the size as you want it, and then you can just print it and you can transfer it directly onto your watercolor paper. I like to use carbon paper, otherwise known as transfer paper, but you could also use a light box, and if you don't have a light box or transfer paper, you can actually just put everything up against a window with the template underneath your watercolor paper, and as long as there's some light outside shining through the window, you should be able to see the lines of the template even through pretty thick watercolor paper. I've done this lots of times, and it does work. So then you can just transfer this drawing directly to your watercolor paper, and then that is all done for you. And I really like to have templates available because I know that drawing can be a big barrier to just getting down to painting. And so that is why I like to make those available. And plus, if you do the painting and you don't like how it turns out, you don't have to worry about redrawing everything from scratch. You already have a template and it's easy enough just to transfer onto your watercolor paper. Now, I admit, this is probably the most complex illustration that I've done so far in this series. And I also spent the most amount of time inking and painting this one, which is a big part of the reason why much of the video will be sped up. So I hope that you are okay with that. I really try to demonstrate techniques in real time, and then when that becomes something that is just repeated, I try to just speed those parts up so that you're able to see the entire painting process in a very feasible amount of time, which I try to limit to about 20 minutes. So what I'm doing first, as I've done with my other illustrations, is I'm using my dip pen to outline the illustration with India ink. And India ink is a waterproof ink, meaning that I can apply water and watercolor over it and it won't smudge. If you don't like to use dip pens, then I would recommend getting micron pens. These are just your typical, I think they're called technical pens. They come in lots of different sizes and they have waterproof ink in them. If you are interested in any of the supplies that I'm using, I do have a link for the supplies I use in the description of all of my videos as well. It takes you to an Amazon list, and I put this together not because I think that you need to buy things on Amazon, but basically just to give you a better visual idea of the things that I use. Some of the things I've had people ask me a lot about is my porcelain palette. That is something I did get on Amazon, but there are also a lot of porcelain or ceramic palettes on Etsy, and so I would recommend going to Etsy, searching for ceramic or porcelain watercolor palettes, and seeing what might be available there. Because of course I definitely want people to support makers rather than big companies if they choose to do that. So for this illustration, at least at first, right now, I've only outlined the main subject of this illustration, which is the hot cocoa stand, the child running the hot cocoa stand, and then the sledder coming for refreshments. This illustration was inspired by my desire to illustrate some winter activities, namely sledding, because that's something that I did a lot as a child. And then the hot cocoa stand is actually inspired just from my memories of having Kool-Aid stands when I was a kid. So of course that was in the summertime. And there was one summer that my sister and I set up our Kool-Aid stand by the swimming pool, which is crazy that they even allowed us to do that because they had a snack bar there. I don't think that would ever fly nowadays. And we made so much money in one day. For being little kids, I think we made like $150. It was kind of crazy. And then we were never allowed to do it again. But it was a fun time and a good memory, and I wanted to kind of incorporate that a little bit into a winter theme. Now, the only place I used masking fluid in this illustration was just on the little Christmas lights that I wanted hanging on the stand. So I just masked out the lights so I could save those for last and make those really bright. And now I'm actually using a micron pen because initially I thought I didn't want to have any ink in the background at all because I like to leave the backgrounds pretty soft. But then I realized that it might be really frustrating for me to possibly lose the little light lines that I made for all these sledders in the distance. And so I went ahead and I kind of just very loosely inked those in with some broken lines and then kind of just roughly put in some vertical lines where I want those distant trees to be. And now I am ready to actually start painting. Just make sure that your masking fluid is completely dry. I actually did take a break to allow for that to dry entirely because I don't want to get masking fluid into the bristles of any of my brushes. First thing I'm going to do is apply a light wash over this entire background. As with my other couple of illustrations I've done in the last couple of days, I want to have this illustration be dominantly Payne's Gray, and so I use that quite a lot for the backgrounds because it's a nice, cool neutral. It really, I think, adds to that sense of winter and it being cold and snowy. And so I'm going to use that for this as well. Although in my other illustrations, my background was kind of dark, and for this one I want to keep the background a lot lighter. So I'm applying clear water over the top half of the background before I add any pigment. And then I'm just going to go in really light with this Payne's Gray. The only areas I really need to avoid is just the subjects in the foreground. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly paint even over all the sledders in the background because they're going to be a little bit more muted in color anyway. I don't need them to be bright or vivid because I don't want them to stand out too much. And since I have all of my lights masked out, I don't have to worry about those, which is nice. So obviously these kids are all sledding in the background, so it's obviously snowy. But I'm going to reserve all of the white snow for the foreground so I have more contrast up there. And I want to have a little bit of a sense of atmosphere as well because this illustration has probably the most depth of any of the ones that I've done before. So I'm going to be a little bit more careful on kind of building up atmosphere. And this is something I really like to do. I like to add a little bit of darker pigment and then right away I go in with my paper towel to lift some of it up and leave a little bit of texture behind. And so I'm not necessarily going in and actually painting the trees at this point. I'm just applying a slightly more pigmented wash over all these trees in the background so that they're all nice and soft and kind of merged together. But I will be working a little bit more on those trees to define them just a little bit more. And again, I think that this will just kind of add to a sense of atmosphere overall in this composition. Because of course, objects in the distance are going to be a little bit softer, a little bit more muted. And so that's what I really want to build up in the distance. You may occasionally hear my dogs snoring. And if you've seen my other videos, you know that that is a feature of my videos. You get to hear my dogs snoring because I have two dogs. They're both, they both have Boston Terrier in them, but they're both mixed and they're both crazy and they love to play with each other and make a lot of interesting background noises. So I do all of my voiceovers when they are snoozing, and they like to sleep right next to me, of course. And so every once in a while, you're going to get a little snort. And I feel like I have to explain that because I just kind of shudder to think what people might think these noises are otherwise. So you'll notice I'm still on the Payne's Gray, and I'm just kind of adding a little bit of definition to the hills and the snow and kind of where slopes are happening and shadows, just kind of making it up. I don't have any kind of photo reference for this at all. And I feel like as long as you keep it really loose and light, it's not going to be a big deal just to make it up. So now I'm actually going in and defining these distant trees. And I'm not going to necessarily want all these trees to be the same value of this Payne's Gray, but right now I'm just kind of blocking them in as all the same value just for the sake of getting them all in place, and then I will decide which trees I want to be more in the foreground and more dominant, and then those ones I'm going to make a little bit darker with more pigment. So as with any kind of evergreen tree, I just keep it, in that kind of pyramid shape roughly and let the edges be nice and rough. I guess for some reason, just because it's winter, I think all the trees are going to be evergreen. And really, I think obviously we kind of associate evergreen type trees with winter. But most likely, if this is some park, it's going to have a mix of trees, but painting other kinds of trees is kind of hard because, they won't even have leaves on them, so they just have branches and twigs all over the place. So I'm just pretending that this is a park where there's only evergreen trees, apparently. Now you can see I'm going in with my Payne's Gray. It's a lot more pigmented now, and so I'm picking out which trees I want to be more in the foreground, and those ones are going to be darker, while the other ones will be a little bit more muted. And now I'm also looking at these sledders in the distance and just seeing where I can apply some Payne's Gray. My only real goal in painting like the clothes on all the children is just to have them not all dressed exactly the same way. So I'm not going to give them all like gray pants and red coats. So I'm just trying to mix it up a little bit. And then in the foreground here, I use the Payne's Gray on the thermos with the hot cocoa in it. And then I'm going to block in this little decorative tree on the stand, which I will glaze over with yellow to make it a little bit more green eventually. And then same with these children in the foreground. I don't want them both to have the same clothes on or the same color patterns. So I already know that I want the hat on the child running the stand to be red, so I'm not going to give both kids red hats. So I'll probably give this child buying the hot cocoa kind of more of a muted red coat. And then the child in the stand is going to have a red hat and then kind of a green coat. And then too, because red is such a bold color, I don't want to overuse it. So I'm going to be careful about where I apply it. So I'm giving this child a red hat and red mittens. And then I'll put some other red accents on the stand. And also When I apply any red to the children in the distance, I've added a lot more water to that mix because, again, I want those kids in the distance to be a little bit more muted. I don't want them to have colors that are just as bright as the reds in the foreground. And then for the banner on the hot cocoa stand, I'll just alternate that between red, green, and white. And then this little plate that there are some cookies on, I guess will also be red. And then to create some green, I'm going to first apply a fairly light wash of Payne's Gray in the areas that I want to be green. And then same as what I do with that decorative tree, I'm going to just glaze some yellow on top to get kind of a muted green. And this right here, if you're wondering, it's a bunch of like styrofoam cups that are just stacked up. Figured I would just add a little bit of practicality to this stand. Of course, he's got to have some cups lined up. And now I'm using sepia to block in the stand. I'll add some texture to it later with Payne's Gray and even a little bit more sepia. So right now, just kind of getting it blocked in, and since it's wood, it doesn't matter if it's a little bit rough. Just kind of avoiding the banner and then these two signs that are tacked on to the stand. And then this kid that is kind of in the distance and walking up to the stand, he kind of reminds me of one of the bullies from A Christmas Story. So I gave him a similar colored jacket, and he has like, I don't know what those hats are called that that kid is wearing in that movie, but I gave him one of those little hats. He's just kind of a short, stocky little kid. Totally not a bully. Okay, so I used some Payne's Gray to add a little texture to the stand. Then I went ahead and started glazing in the yellow on top of the Payne's Gray on the banner. So you can see it's kind of a muted green, and I'm using that same muted green, which I just went ahead and mixed for the jacket of this child running the stand, and also using that on the tree to make it just a little bit more green. So it's obviously not a real bright or vivid green. And for your own project, you know, obviously you get to use whatever colors you want. I recommend just picking out a limited few so that you get a good color harmony going within your composition. But I think there's a lot of flexibility there, and you can just kind of choose what you like best. I really like this color palette. For this child's jacket, I'm kind of just washing in some red. I'm keeping it light because I'm going to tone it down a little bit. Oh, I also used the sepia color on the cookies as well. And then I want these signs not to be so white, so I'm just kind of lightly brushing in some very diluted pigment in some areas. The child running the stand has kind of a Santa hat on, so I'll pretty much leave the trim on that white. And then for the trim on this other child's hat, I'll make it a little bit like fuzzy or furry. Just kind of giving a little bit of a weathered look to that stand. And then dry brushing some texture onto that child's hat. So now I'm going over his coat with a wash or a glaze of the Payne's Gray just to mute that red a little bit. Adding a little more texture to the hat with some dry brush. And we're getting pretty close to being done here, just kind of looking in the background to see if there's any articles of clothing that need to be addressed back there. Painting this child on the side, painting his little mitten kind of a green because I didn't know what other color to make it. Alright, so I'm cleaning up my palette, but I'm not going to be done painting because there's going to be a few things. Well, one thing that I missed, which is the sled of that child on the right. Totally forgot to paint it, so I had to do that even after I removed the tape. And obviously I need to paint in the lights on the stand, but first I have to remove the masking fluid in order to do that. So far though, I think that this illustration is looking pretty good. And now I'm just kind of gently peeling off the masking fluid on the bulb, so you'll see that there's a lot of white there. And I think I overcomplicated the way that I painted the bulbs. I tried to, well, first of all, I went back in even before I started painting. I'm going to put even a little bit more masking fluid on, just like a little dot where I think the brightest part of the bulb should be. I think this was actually a little bit overkill. But I guess my idea was that to make these look really bright, they would need that really white center. And then the other thing that I did that wasn't really necessary is I tried to do just a little bit of yellow around the center as well. So there's the white center, and then I thought it would be yellow, and then the very outer edges would be red. But I think that the yellow was unnecessary. So you'll see me doing that first, but really I think that you could, maybe keep the white dots in the center if you want. But this step I think is unnecessary. I think I could have just gone in with the red. So now I'm going in with this really bright red, trying my best just to keep it around the edges, but these bulbs are so small that this task was just a little bit futile. And I want these lights to be really, really bold, so I'm trying to use as much pigment as I can without kind of going overboard. And then I just have to wait for that paint to dry, and then I will remove the little bit of masking fluid in the center of those bulbs. And now I'm just kind of looking for areas to emphasize a little bit more if I need to, while I wait for those to dry. And since they're so small, they won't take very long. So I'm thinking that I'm done painting at this point, but I totally forgot to paint that little sled on the side. And I don't even realize it until later after I've turned off my camera and everything. So I turned my camera back on and I painted that little sled because it was going to bug me otherwise. But you kind of get the overall gist of how this is looking. But I guess I will show you a close-up. Really like how this turned out, and I really like this little concept of all these kids kind of sledding. I made the kids in the background kind of just doing crazy things. They're not all just like happily going down the hill. Some of them are kind of flying up in the air. Some are getting a running start. Others are walking back up the hill. And then one kid is coming in for some refreshments. So I think that this is a really fun illustration. And I'm back and I'm realizing I've got to paint this sled. And I decided I would just paint it solid red, no big deal. Not going to worry too much about it. Easy enough. And I just have to be careful around the edge because I've already removed the tape and I, just don't want a big swoosh of red going outside that nice border I have. All right, so that is it. And I guess I'll show you another close-up now that it is truly finished. Remember that you can easily try this little illustration yourself. You can get that template for free in the links below. And I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you wouldn't mind, I hope that you will subscribe to my very new channel. Give me one of those thumbs up thingies, and most importantly, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.